Take a look at this quote from a man who we haven't studied yet, but many of you will know his name, even if you're not quite sure what he's done. He said to Nikita Khrushchev, the General Secretary of the USSR, "Well, Mr. Secretary, it's going to be a cold winter." So trying to figure out who this president is and why he might say this to Khrushchev in 1961. We'll have a look at the answer later on in the lesson. So this lesson we're going to be looking at why Berlin was split into two in 1961. Now that seems a bit of an odd question given how much we've spent on East and West Berlin already, but in 1961 the Berlin Wall was built by the East. Now this divided Easterners and Westerners in Berlin for nearly 40 years. It falls in 1989 and just 2 years later the Cold War ends. So we're going to spend this lesson and next lesson looking at the important events surrounding this wall. So before we look at the building of the Berlin Wall, it's worth spending a few minutes having a look at the history of Germany and Berlin in particular after World War II. So pause this video and try and come up with one sentence to describe each of these 5 events. So the Potsdam Conference was the last of the 3 wartime conferences on our course. So at this conference, or this summit, the 4 great powers, Britain, France, America and the Soviet Union, all agreed that Germany would be split into 4 and each of those zones would be controlled by those countries. But because Berlin would be deep in the heart of the Soviet-controlled zone, that itself would be split into 4, again going to each of those 4 countries. They also agreed that no country would be able to make individual decisions about the future of Berlin or Germany. In other words, they all agreed to make joint decisions as 4. Now, within a few years, this was changed by the West. Britain, France and America joined their zones into Trizonia and they created a new currency called the Deutschmark. This was the trigger for Stalin's Berlin blockade in 1948. He saw the West uniting against the East and realised that he needed to control all of Berlin to have a hope of containing the spread of capitalism. So he shut down all roads, railways and canals into West Berlin. His idea was to starve out West Berliners so that they would beg to join East Berlin, even if they didn't actually want to be communist. So rather than fire a shot, rather than try and provoke Stalin militarily, the West decided to use an airlift. So they were dropping supplies into the airports of Berlin. A plane was landing up to every 90 seconds. It lasted nearly a year, but at the end Stalin realised that the blockade had failed. In response, the West created NATO to try and show Stalin and the East that they would not stand for any sort of aggression like this. 1953, Stalin dies and eventually Khrushchev will take over. And you might remember Khrushchev's de-Stalinisation speech or the secret speech. The West believed him to be someone that was completely unlike Stalin. They thought that they would be able to come to agreements such as the Austrian State Treaty in 1955. However, in the same year, 1955, West Germany joins NATO and in response, Khrushchev creates the Warsaw Pact. So from this point onwards, pretty much every Western European country is in one alliance and pretty much every Eastern European country is in another alliance. This means that any action on Germany in particular, either East or West Germany or East or West Berlin, could provoke a Europe-wide war. We're going to be making notes about the causes of the Berlin Wall, and next lesson we'll go on to look at the events and the results of it and how it affected the Cold War. Now, if you're using the document on Schoology, if you download the Word document, it's got this in a much longer form, spreading around 3 or 4 sheets wide. That's for this lesson and next lesson. If you're not using the Word document, can you copy these terms down onto some paper? Give yourself at least a page and a half, or maybe even 2 pages. That way, you're giving yourself plenty of space to write these. So we've got the keywords, and each time we're going to go through and you add a little bit of extra detail. If you want to, pages 40, 41 and 42 have even more information for you, but you should be able to get a grade 9 using just the information I'm giving you. So we need to have a look at the longer term causes of the Berlin crisis in the 1960s. And on this slide, we've got information which is basically the same sorts of reasons as to why Stalin caused the blockade in the 1940s. These problems haven't gone away. If anything, they've gotten worse for Khrushchev nearly 20 years later. So West Berlin was often seen as a window to the West. Khrushchev believed in peaceful coexistence. He didn't believe in direct confrontation with the West, at least when he first started being the General Secretary. That meant that propaganda between capitalism and communism was crucial. He needed the world to see that communism was better. But the thing is, if you're an East Berliner, you could walk across the street, you can go visit your friend or your cousin or your family members, and you would see that on average, their life was just better, even if they did the same job. So on the right-hand side, we've got a table showing how many households owned certain luxury goods across East and West Germany, but it's going to be similar in East and West Berlin. Now, you might not think of a fridge or a TV as a luxury good, but these are real cutting-edge technologies in the mid-1900s. Loads of families wouldn't have them in Britain either. But you can see, for example, 5% of East Germans had a car compared to 14% of West Germans. Or something like a fridge, just so important for day-to-day food, keeping things fresh, keeping things good for longer. 6% of East Germans, whereas nearly half of West Germans would have one. Also, the quality of these goods would generally be much better in West Germany. They'd be cheaper as well. In other words, they're better in pretty much every single way. A separate problem is that West Berlin was also a really good way for spies from the West to go into the East. Now, that is true for the other way around, but it's almost easier to get into the West from the East because the East tended to be more closed down. So the idea of a window to the West was a problem for Stalin and it was a problem for Khrushchev. A more pressing problem for Khrushchev is what impact this would have on East German and East European economies. Skilled workers, and when I say skilled, it could be a technical job such as a doctor or a scientist, or it could be a labouring job such as a builder or a plumber. If you're going to get paid more for doing the same job in the West, why would you not just move to the West? Take your whole family and you'll all have a better life, especially if that is just a matter of working in a different company in the same city of Berlin. So this is known as the brain drain, as demonstrated by that amazing diagram I've just found somewhere on the internet. Now, a statistic which would be really useful to remember is just quite how big the brain drain was. So between 1949, when the Berlin blockade finished, and 1961, when the Berlin Wall was built, 4 million people from Eastern Europe went to the West through West Berlin. The reason they're going through West Berlin is that actually travel from East Germany to West Germany was really difficult. You needed to have specific papers from the East German government to allow you to do that. But travel from East Berlin to West Berlin was completely fine. There were no barriers. So you can't go from an East German city to a West German city on a train very easily. But from West Berlin, you can get a train to any country in West Europe, and from that point onwards, the East cannot capture you. They cannot keep you there. So 20% of the population of East Germany had left. Most of them had simply gone to West Germany. So again, in that competition between capitalism and communism, you've got a clear sense in that communism is losing. But more than that, because they're losing workers, skilled workers, their economy suffers and the capitalist economy gets better because of this. So the idea of a window to the West and a brain drain, they're both two key phrases which are strongly linked together. Now, part of the reason why I love this part of the course is that you get to hear a bunch of great quotes. Now, these are the sorts of things which would be fantastic to remember in the exam, but you don't need them. It's not going to be the difference between a fail or a grade 9. But it's the kind of thing where if you can remember it and write it in the examiner is going to be impressed because it's really good, precise, factual detail. And the great thing about the Berlin Wall is that you've got Khrushchev, he's got such a magical way of words. Now, he described West Berlin as a fishbone stuck in my throat. Now, to explain what he means by that, I want you to imagine that you're on a date with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. You've gone all out. You've gone to Bella Italia. You've seen on the special, there's the sea bass. You've never had it before. You're not even quite sure what it is. And you get delivered this kind of like thing swimming in sauce. You go, oh, it's a fish. Oh, fantastic. And you listen to them talk about, TikTok, whatever you cool kids do nowadays. Then you feel it in the back of your throat. You just kind of just start to have to choke a little bit, and then you're trying to pass it off. You don't want to wreck the day, you don't want to think you're a loser or anything, but you just start to literally die. You feel like you're dying. You just go like, well, and you cough it out. The date's ruined. Which is absolutely awful. That's how Khrushchev feels about West Berlin. It's something which isn't actually going to kill you, but it feels like it is going to kill you. It's a constant source of annoyance. The problem for him is that you can't just cough up West Berlin, as it were. There is no clear solution to the problem. So his attempted solution is the Berlin Ultimatum in 1958. So in 1958, he gave a speech giving the West 6 months to take every single soldier, tank, or airplane out of West Berlin. The idea is that East and West Berlin would be reunited and it would become a free city. In other words, it would be truly independent of either the West or the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, that is nonsense. There is no way he would ever let Berlin make independent choices, because if that were the case, there's a danger that the whole thing would turn capitalist and the propaganda campaign would be ruined. As a result, the West, and America in particular, refuses to move on the Berlin Ultimatum. Instead, they'll try to find a different solution. Now, have a quick think about that stretching challenge. The whole point of an ultimatum is that it's a final warning. Do this or else. Now, a good ultimatum has a clear all else. Do this homework, otherwise you'll get detention. But for this, there is no or else. He just says you must leave and doesn't actually say what will happen if the West refuse to leave. So how far do you agree that this was an empty threat? There's clearly some things which he could have done, like a Berlin blockade or something similar. I suppose he could have started an armed confrontation, but that would make things so much worse. So is there actually anything he could have done to carry out this ultimatum? So President Eisenhower had to try and fix the divide between East and West. If no decision is met, then the ultimatum will run out of time and something will happen. So in 1959, Khrushchev visited Eisenhower in America, and the two of them got on personally. It's so important to remember that loads of the decisions in the Cold War are dictated by how close the leaders of America and the Soviet Union are. When they're close together, agreements tend to be made. When they're far apart, that's some of the worst periods in the Cold War, where World War III is not incredibly impossible in the minds of people at the time. So Khrushchev took back the ultimatum. The 6 month timer no longer exists. They're promising to come up with new agreements or some way to make new agreements. Khrushchev even invites Eisenhower to come to Moscow the next year, and he would be the first president since Roosevelt in the 1940s. Now, where they're going to specifically come up with the agreement is with all other world leaders like Britain and, of course, the German leaders at the Paris summit in 1960. Unfortunately, the U-2 spy plane incident just before the Paris summit ruined any chance at that. Now, before we look at what the incident was, it's worth talking about these U-2 spy planes because they will come up on this lesson and in a lesson on Cuba. The reason they are so important is that they are the main way Americans were spying on the East in terms of their military installations or sorts of high-tech or high-guarded secrets. So these planes could fly 20 kilometers in the air, that's over twice the height of Mount Everest, and from that height they can take incredibly detailed photos of the ground. So they could try and figure out if the Soviet Union were moving troops or hiding missiles or anything like that. The great thing about 20 kilometers in the air is that it was so high the USSR's military couldn't detect them or shoot them down. So it was fantastic for spying and not being caught on spying. Unfortunately, they got caught spying and the plane got shut down. So 2 weeks before the Paris summit began, the pilot, Gary Powers, was arrested and interrogated by the Soviet Union. The problem is, the Americans believed that the plane had been destroyed beyond all recognition and the pilot had died. So the best thing for America to do at that point would be to lie and say we weren't spying on the Soviet Union. Instead, that was a weather plane. In other words, it is there, it was an American plane flying over the Soviet Union, but we were only doing it for peaceful purposes to kind of track weather patterns and predict what's going to be happening in the next few weeks. So Eisenhower lies to the world, and Khrushchev is able to bring proof that the Americans have lied. As a result, he demands an apology from Eisenhower. And to be honest, an apology was worth it, wasn't it? He was spying, he was caught out on spying. At least he can come up with some sort of justification and try and soothe the Soviet leader's ego. He doesn't do that. He point blank refuses to apologize. As a result, the Paris summit fails after a single day. Eisenhower's invitation to Moscow is rescinded, is taken back, so he never gets to see the beautiful land of Russia, and no agreements on Berlin or Germany are made. Eisenhower stops being president at the end of 1960 simply because you're not allowed to be president more than twice in America. He's succeeded by President John F. Kennedy. Now, the reason I've got Mayor Quimby from The Simpsons up there is that Quimby's character is based off of the whole Kennedy family. He's seen as a bit of a schmooze, more interested in womanizing or getting drunk or taking bribes, not a serious politician. And that's exactly how Kennedy was seen by many people in America and certainly by Khrushchev. He was incredibly young. He's the youngest president that's ever existed at the tender age of 43. But the point is, he hasn't got the history and the reputation that Eisenhower had. Eisenhower was the leader of all the Allied forces in World War II against the Nazis. He's not a man that can be intimidated. Khrushchev believed, however, this young, inexperienced Kennedy could be manipulated somehow. These ideas were further increased by the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, which we'll look at in a couple of lessons' time. But for now, just know that Kennedy inherited an incredibly bad plan, which made America look even more foolish and evil trying to take over another country. When the leaders met for the first time at the Vienna summit in 1961, Khrushchev brought back the Berlin Ultimatum. In other words, the 6-month timer has started again. All Western forces must leave West Berlin so that it can be reunited into an independent city. Now, this was the last time that the two spoke face to face, and Kennedy is supposed to have said, well, Mr. Secretary, it's going to be a cold winter. In other words, another veiled threat, just like the ultimatum. Kennedy was promising some sort of consequence for Khrushchev's actions. Now, what form that took was a massive increase in US military spending, particularly in Europe. So the US was already one of the biggest military spenders just behind the Soviet Union, but an extra $3.5 billion is spent, and most of that is putting forces in either West Germany specifically or Europe in general. So it's a clear challenge to Khrushchev and the Soviet Union saying we will not let Europe go without a fight. We're going to quickly have a look at the leader of East Germany, a man called Walter Ulbricht. You can see from his dates he was the leader for an incredibly long period of time, 1950 to 1971. It's not massively important to remember this quote, but it does show how weird it is living in a communist country. So in June 1961, he publicly said nobody has any intention of erecting or building a wall. It's the first time the idea of a wall was spoken aloud by public officials. There had been many rumours that something was planned, so Ulbricht said, there is no plan, no one talk about it, we're not going to build a wall. 2 months later, they build the wall. Now, most of this is done overnight. So it's not the wall you might have seen in textbooks or TV or anything like that. It just begins as barbed wire fences or barriers and with physical guards blocking people from going into West Berlin. The reason this is done overnight is to prevent people hurriedly moving over to the west if they know that the barriers are going to go up. Now that leads to some awkward situations where it could be, for example, you were staying at your aunt and uncle's in East Berlin and expecting to go back to your parents in a day or two, but you suddenly find that you are unable to go, at least without jumping through many hoops from the East German government. It was very easy to take your family from West Berlin into East Berlin, because that looked great for the East German government, but to take your family from East Germany to West Germany, even if it's to reunite them and bring them all together, many people were unable to do that for several decades. Now, we've got this image at the bottom right, and you can see the bit in bold is the specific quote from Walter Ulbricht. This was a propaganda victory for the West, although obviously at a very high price. The idea that the East German leader has lied to its people just 2 months before it carries out this awful action is used time and time again by the West to show that communists can't be trusted. Now, it does say that Ulbricht and Khrushchev closed the borders. It's not actually clear who was more in charge. It used to be the idea that Ulbricht was betrayed, or at least he was overruled by Khrushchev. But recently, historians have begun to find evidence that maybe Ulbricht was pressuring Khrushchev for it. So it's not an answer which is clear at this point. Maybe in a few more decades when more research has been done, we'll be able to pin it down to one or the other. But for our course, we can just say Khrushchev. If you want more detail, turn to pages 40 to 42 in the textbook and just maybe see it explained in a different way. There's two tasks I'd like everyone to do a little bit of writing on. We've got three leaders who are all responsible for raising tensions. Now, we're not talking about who was the most responsible for building the wall. Obviously, that's Khrushchev. He definitely played a significant role, if not he overruled Ulbricht on it. But which of these leaders is raising tensions in Berlin the most? Is it Khrushchev for his Berlin Ultimatum, bringing the crisis to the head? Is it Eisenhower for refusing to apologise over the U-2 spy plane incident, wrecking that personal relationship between them? Or is it Kennedy? So he doesn't have that personal relationship that Eisenhower had to begin with Eisenhower, and he provokes Khrushchev with that military spending in Europe. That leads on to question two. Thinking about Eisenhower and Kennedy combined, how far should America be blamed for provoking Khrushchev with these tit-for-tat measures? America does something, then the Soviet Union, then the Americans, then the Soviet Union. If you think about the Berlin blockade and airlift, the West are responsible for doing many different things, and then Stalin responds with the Berlin blockade. You've got Bisonia, then Trisonia, then the Deutschmark, and then the Berlin blockade. This one is very much up and down with each side doing different things. Now we're going to have a look at one more quote from Khrushchev here, the poet Khrushchev. Berlin is the testicles of the West. If I want to make the West scream, I squeeze on Berlin. Now he's supposed to have said this a couple of years afterwards, kind of joking to other Soviet communists. The idea here, and I need to explain this one again, particularly to any girls who are listening, you might want to try and imagine how painful that experience would be if you were a guy. You might think like, oh, that's, ow, oh, I wouldn't want that. This is probably the most painful experience you could ever see. So rather than just like a, ow, it's going to be something like, ah! Again, the idea is you're not going to die from this, but it's going to cause extreme discomfort. So you've got this idea of a fishbone in my throat for Khrushchev and testicles being squeezed for the West. That leads on to a stretch and challenge here. How far does the building of the Berlin Wall show that Khrushchev was no better than Stalin? Both of them have tried to act on Berlin. If you think about it, they've done it in different ways. Stalin tries to steal the West Berlin. Khrushchev tries to isolate it, or at least prevent East Berliners going into West Berlin. So these two actions are done for very different reasons, but does the action itself show that Khrushchev is just another Stalin? Final thing we're going to have a look at, if you haven't done enough thinking already, is a quick timeline test. So we've got 10 key events that we've studied so far. The first one is already in the correct order. The Tehran Conference is the very first thing you need to know for our course. Try and figure out in what order each of these should appear. So we've got Tehran Conference at the beginning. Obviously, we've got the building of the Berlin Wall for number 9 at the end. Try and get them all in the correct order, and try also to think of any dates that you might remember. So these are the answers. There's some things here which you just need to know. So for example, you need to know that the Truman Doctrine is before the Berlin blockade. But if you get something like 8 and 7 the wrong way round, if you thought that West Germany joined NATO while Stalin was still alive, that's fine, because those two events aren't clearly linked together. There's no reason why they had to happen in that way. But the Truman Doctrine led to things like Bisonia and Trisonia. That leads to the Berlin blockade, and obviously the airlift happens because of the Berlin blockade. In terms of the dates, the more you know, the better. But none of these on here are specifically dates which you have to know for your course, otherwise you're going to completely embarrass yourself in front of the examiner. I would say if there's 3 dates which would be really, really good to remember, it's the Potsdam Conference at the end of World War II in 1945, the Berlin blockade in 1948-9, and the Berlin Wall in 1961. So that's all of the reasons why Berlin was split into two with the Berlin Wall in 1961. I apologise for having a lesson so full of content, but this is probably the biggest single event that we've looked at in our course so far. I do promise next lesson on the results of the Berlin Wall, there'll be a lot less writing, so your hand can have a bit of a break.